If you were to go to the shop right now, what would you be able to buy from $12? Not much. Maybe a hard candy or something small like that, maybe not even that much. Well, what would be the case in 1946? Maybe you, your parents, or your grandparents could answer you this question. What would $12 buy then? Maybe something bigger. Maybe even a scoop of ice cream, half a parking ticket, lemonade. I'm not really sure what kind of things people bought back then. But you can see how much money inflates over time. And it's almost expected to happen. It's almost a natural part of life. But what happens if this inflation gets out of hand and the numbers become almost incomprehensibly large? Well, in history, there have been four enormous hyperinflations recorded. If you ask most people, they would say that the biggest one was in Germany after the First World War. And yes, that was pretty bad. In 1923, when Germany finally put an end to that inflation, it took 1 trillion old marks, the previous currency, to get one new Rentenmark, the new currency. And that seems like a huge number, 1 trillion. Oh my god. But that is not the biggest in history. Actually, there are three more hyperinflations that make the German one look almost pathetically small. One in Hungary in 1946, and then in Yugoslavia between 92 and 93, and finally the one in Zimbabwe between 2004 to 2009. And of all of these, probably Hungary's was the worst ever in recorded history. Now, I need to say that I am not a finance expert at all. I cannot really talk about money. Large numbers scare me, but I wanted to retell this story to show just how bad Hungarian history really was. Now, let's get started with the story of the hyperinflation of 1946. Sadly, Hungary has never been a stranger to inflation. During World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was on the losing side of the war, and after the war, Hungary was broken up into multiple pieces. Now it was this crippled, tiny, irrelevant country that didn't really know how to function, and they didn't have the proper finance gurus in the country to do the economy any good. So some not so qualified financial experts thought that printing out money in excess was going to fill the gap in the economy. Well, it didn't. The monarchy's currency was called kronen, and before World War I, $1 was worth 5 kronen. But after 1924, there was already 70,000 kronen to $1. As you can see, that's already a huge inflation, but not as bad as what we are going to talk about. So at the time, all they did was that they changed the currency from kronen to what they call now pengő. Pengő was going to be the new currency. And life went on. Years passed by, everything seemed fine, and Hungary was spared for much of the Second World War. It really wasn't until 1944 that Hungary became the battleground between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And as you can imagine, this was devastating to our country. Half of all industries was damaged by 90%. Railways were bombed down, transportation seemed almost impossible, and whatever was left was either taken by Nazi Germany or it was taken as reparations by the Soviet Union. What happens in this case is clear. Because of the destruction, there is no production, and if there is too little production, prices go up, and that happened very quickly. And because there was no tax base for the government to rely on, the government didn't really know what to do, so they came up with the worst idea of all, which was to print money to solve the issue. Kids, printing money in excess is never the solution. It's a bad idea. Stop it. The government started loaning money to banks at incredibly low rates. and the banks would go and loan that money to companies. And then the government would hire workers directly and loan money to consumers to buy things. And in the end, the government was practically giving out free money. That's not a good thing. Let's see how much money the government was actually printing out. In the July of 1945, so before all of this, there was 25 billion pengu in circulation. But by July 1946, so 1 year later, there was 47 septillion pengu in circulation. A septillion is trillion. Oh my god, this is such a big number, my brain can't even compute. So let's see how that would actually look in real life. Something that would cost 379 pengu in September of 1945 would cost 1 trillion pengu by July 1946. Jesus. At the very height of the hyperinflation, prices were rising at a rate of 41.9 quadrillion %, and it presented itself as that prices doubled every 15 hours. By this point, the government simply stopped collecting tax because it was pointless. Whatever they had collected the day before, the value was wiped out by the next morning. But let's try to put this into context for you, the viewer. What would this even mean in dollars? Well, get this. Before the war, so in March 1941, $1 was worth 5 pengu. And by 1946, $1 was worth 8.3 sextillion pengu. And here is a side note. I have seen it in some sources that claim 460 sextillion to the USD, but that is impossible. That would be more than the entire country's money supply. Besides, I do have to add that these numbers may not be entirely accurate. These are just estimates anyway. Of course, as you can imagine, there were some feeble attempts to try to fix this issue, but pretty much all of them was unsuccessful. For example, in December of 1945, the government imposed a 75% capital levy by making people turn in 400 pengu, and in return they would get a 100 pengu bill with a stamp on it to indicate that it was legal tender. But this was like putting a band-aid on a broken window, because they didn't stop printing money. But as I mentioned before, the government had a really hard time collecting tax. But they knew that they couldn't go on like that forever. They had to somehow manage collecting tax. So what they came up with was to change the currency from pengu to ado pengu. Ado standing for tax. And they thought that this new currency was indexed to inflation, but it wasn't really. It eventually succumbed to the inflation and it didn't change anything. The numbers were just as bad as before. So you may be asking how people even dealt with this onslaught of money, and how did the government manage printing out so many zeros on a banknote? The answer is easy. They didn't. They had to change the name of the currency. From pengu, we went to mil pengu, standing for million pengu. And when that wasn't enough, they had to change from that to bil pengu, short for bilio pengu. By the way, if you are ever confused about why the same numbers are called different names in Hungarian and in English, that is because Hungarian uses the long scale system, whereas English uses the short scale system. The long scale proceeds by the powers of 1 million, whereas the short scale proceeds by the power of 1,000. So, for example, 1 billion means 1,000 millions in the short scale, while it means 1 million millions in the long scale. And as a fun fact or side note, all of these banknotes actually looked identical. They had the same picture on them. The only difference was the color and if it started with an M or a B. And at one point, people became so overwhelmed with the value of this money that they just couldn't even comprehend on a daily basis, that they stopped referring to it by the number and they start calling it by the color. So if you went into the shop and you wanted to buy a loaf of bread, the cashier would tell you to give her 2 greens and 1 blue. When their money became worthless, shops closed and remained closed until the new currency, the forint, was established and stabilized. In the meanwhile, city people had to resort to going to the countryside to exchange their valuables for food. Workers went to pick up their wages in cash with luggages and boxes to be able to bring all those banknotes home. And the banknote with the highest denomination ever printed in recorded history was the milliard bill pengu, which stood for a billion trillion pengu. Well, what would you think this would buy you in the shop? Well, not much, because the milliard bill pengu was worth about 12 cents. The inflation has been going on for about a year, and the hyperinflation had been at its very peak for an entire month before the currency was finally replaced by the forint on the 1st of August 1946. At the time, 1 forint was worth 400,000 quadrillion pengu. And the stabilization actually worked. The prices remained quite stable all the way until the 1960s, and Hungary still uses the forint, so things seem fine now. But as you can imagine, the mil pengu and bill pengu and milliard bill pengu were literally trash on the street. That's how worthless they were. The cost of the paper that they were printed on was more expensive than the actual value of the banknote. Just imagine that you're entering this post-apocalyptic scene where people are just throwing away cash on the street. I wouldn't know if I'm in a very rich place or in a very poor place. But whenever we are talking about inflation, we have to ask who is actually paying for this inflation? Who has to bear the damages? Well, of course, the working class. Who else, you silly? Of course it was gonna be the working class. People, despite having stable jobs, lost 80% of their wages, and many of them were forced into deep poverty because of this hyperinflation, and creditors were all wiped out. But the final question, probably the most important question, is, was it all worth it? Did the intentional inflation of the money achieve the goal that it was supposed to set, which was to restart the economy and restart the industries? And it kind of did, weirdly. Production restarted and most industries were able to make a great recovery from all of this. The railroads were rebuilt, so transportation wasn't an issue anymore, and even much of the capital stock was replaced. But sadly, just like with most of the cases and stories that I cover on my channel, this one also doesn't have a happy ending, or at least not for the time being. Because all of the positive things that the country was able to achieve with this incredibly unbelievable hyperinflation, that only lasted 3 years. In 1949, Hungary was overtaken by the Soviet Union and our fate was sealed by the communists. But that is a story for another day. And I hope that you found this case at least a little bit informative or interesting. I know it wasn't that easy to follow. There were so many numbers, so many zeros, but I tried my best to make it understandable. Let me know if you are interested in other weird or fascinating historical stories like this one, because I have quite a few, but I feel like you need to have a certain affinity or interest in history to want to learn another country's history. But I could take out some interesting snippets here and there that I think are worth mentioning. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Don't forget to like, subscribe. You can even write me a nice comment. I like reading comments. And I see you next time. Bye!